Hello and welcome to another episode of Never Mind the Dambusters, the podcast dedicated to all things Bomber Command, with me, Jane Gulliford-Lowes. And I'm delighted that after a brief intermission, I'm joined again by my co-host James Jeffries. As you may have seen from our social media pages and also on the pod website, we're delighted to be able to offer early access now to new episodes for our paid subscribers. If you want to listen to new episodes before anyone else, you can subscribe at nevermindthedambusters.buzzsprout.com for as little as £2.40 per month. So a huge thank you to the many listeners who have done just that. So James, nice to see you back and sort of in one piece. How are you feeling?
Yeah, I'm on the mend. I was able to do some desk work, and I've been to the shop, and I'm slowly getting there. I still get the twinges and spasms, but the exercises have been amazing, and I'm listening to the experts over this. So yeah, getting there, and I'm back.
Just take it easy. That's good. You need to be ready to go to the RAF Museum conference next week. So are you still going?
Yeah.
Right. Well, you need to keep yourself right for that.
I'm speaking to them. Yeah. Well, yeah, that's the aim.
Right. Keep yourself.
But yeah, I will. So in today's episode, we have something a little different for you. When this episode goes out, all eyes will be focused on ARNHEM for the 80th anniversary commemorations of Operation Market Garden. Rarely has a military operation been more widely debated, and those events of 80 years ago have spawned thousands of books, articles, battlefield tours, and of course, that film, A Bridge Too Far. There is, it seems, an entire ARNHEM industry these days. So today we're going to be discussing the role of RAF bomber aircraft as glider tugs, particularly in the ARNHEM airlift and in the airborne operations generally. Going slightly off our usual topic, we're also going to be talking about the crucial role of the Glider Pilot Regiment in Operation Market Garden.
So we're delighted to welcome to Never Mind the Dambusters, Matt Yates, who is going to enlighten us further. Matt is the Chief Operations Officer for the Vickers Machine Gun Collection and Research Association, and he runs the Chalk Collection, which is a private collection dedicated entirely to the Glider Pilot Regiment. Hello and welcome to Matt.
Hello. Good evening to you both.
Great to have you here, Matt. Really excited to have you on the show and to talk about something that's a little bit different to bombing for a change. Yeah, so it's going to be really cool.
Yeah, exactly. So I think what we'll do is, if we can start just by maybe dispelling a couple of myths, actually, about RAF Transport Command and what they were doing in support of the two airborne divisions that we had in the Second World War. I think that there's a little bit of misunderstanding somewhere that the crews that created initially 38 Wing in 1942 were maybe not too happy to be doing that role, and that they'd rather be bombing. They were trained bomber crews. They were seconded to 38 Wing. Didn't have much say in it, to be perfectly honest. Now, I've done obviously, I've done an awful lot of research on the Glider Pilot Regiment over the years. I've done much less research over RAF Transport Command 38 Wing, which became 38 Group, and also 46 Group joined them later on in the war. And what I've struggled to find is any negativity from any of the crews. I've struggled to find anything with anybody saying, I don't want to do this. This isn't what I signed up for. Quite the opposite, in fact. And initially, in the early days, they were still going off and doing the odd bombing run here and there, and they were dropping leaflets and things like that, which was basically to keep them fully functioning as crews, rather than sort of sitting around waiting for the Glider Pilot Regiment and the Parachute Regiment to sort of pick up what they were doing. Sort of fell by the wayside later on as the airborne divisions became bigger and stronger, and there was more exercises and more operations. They still did go on leaflet dropping runs, and of course they were used extensively for supporting SOE, SAS, and doing an awful lot of resupply missions as well. And we'll see as we go forwards with this just how involved they really were with airborne forces. So initially, RAF Transport Command was established in 1943, and that's sort of a culmination of RAF Ferry Command and also the Army Corporation Command. So they've sort of come together to create Transport Command. It's got several wings. Notably, it's got 38 Wing. And 38 Wing initially is responsible for towing gliders. And this starts off very, very small indeed. They've got some really random aircraft. They've got things like Hectors and Gladiators, Magisters and things like that, which are towing sailplanes, essentially. Long before the Glider Pilot Regiment becomes established, they're actually flying Kirby kites and things like that, which are sailplanes. They're civilian sailplanes. And then as we move into sort of 1941, 42, they developed the Hotspur glider, which is an 8-seat glider. It's only small. It was never used operationally. It was only used as a training glider. And then that's where we have to start looking at different aircraft to be able to pull that glider. So we're looking at things like the Whitley bomber, for instance. And initially, there's obviously a little bit of toing and froing between the RAF and the Army over who should be flying these gliders.
Is there also a lot of competition for resources? I mean, our Bomber Command or whoever's supplying these aircraft, are they complaining about having to loan their aircraft for glider duties?
Absolutely. But I think initially we've got to remember that they're really only given the Whitley bomber, which nobody else really wants.
Well, that's true, yeah.
Later on they get the Albemarle, which again, nobody really wants.
Yeah.
It's underpowered. It's outranged by other bombers. Its bomb carrying potential is low. So there is a little bit of that, and I think that's why they get given things like the Whitley, because it's looked upon as, why should we give up any of our Wellingtons or Halifaxes or anything like that to support this new development? Because we've got to remember as well, the British Airborne Forces, it doesn't exist.
Yeah, it's just an entirely new thing, isn't it?
Yeah, airborne forces and vertical envelopment is a completely new thing. And so the RAF, initially, the first men that go for glider pilot training are RAF pilots. And they're not happy to be there. They don't really want to be there. They're quite despondent, and it doesn't really work very well. And there's a lot of toing and froing between the RAF and the Army, and it goes into Parliament, and it's back and forth. And, Churchill's wanting this force of 5,000 men, developing parachute troops and glider troops, and he's seen how well the Germans have used it. And he's pushing and pushing and pushing, and the Army are pushing, and the Air Force are pushing back, and it goes backwards and forwards and backwards and forwards. And finally, they sort of reach a happy medium where they can really start to develop things. So initially, what was going to happen was there were going to be active bomber squadrons that were going to be seconded to the Glider Pilot Regiment, to airborne forces.
Right.
So they'd be taken away from bombing operations to be able to take part in airborne operations. Now, obviously, you're going to end up in a situation there where you've got men who maybe they're already earmarked for a large bombing offensive, and then the Army come along and say, "Oh, actually, we've got an airborne operation. We need bomber pilots." So then you've got to take them out of there and back in again, and it's just...
So they're going to be doing bombing much more frequently than it be anticipated that they'll be doing airborne operations, presumably. I mean, they're bombing every night.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things that they decided very early on was that wasn't going to work. They were going to have dedicated crews to be able to do this job, because there's a lot of training involved with towing gliders successfully. And I think you'd asked me earlier on, Jane, how much did they work together? And they worked together extremely closely. So a lot of the Glider Pilot Regiment squadrons were on the same bases as the Tug squadrons were. So They would have known their Tug crews. They would have socialised with them. They would have trained with them extensively. Leading up to D-Day, for instance, there was many exercises, some huge exercises where you were taking the whole of 6th Airborne and exercising across Britain, across different airfields with gliders and parachutists, all with 38 Wing. And so they all trained very hard together and very closely together. So as we move through 1942, we see the first operations for 38 Wing and for British Airborne Forces. And the first operation is a parachute operation, and that's Operation Biting, which some people might be familiar with already. Yeah. And that's an operation to take 2nd Battalion Parachute Regiment over to the coast of France to try and capture a Würzburg radar station near Bruneval, which was successful. There was a little bit of argy-bargy on the day because, of course, they were in enemy territory, but it worked, and they were picked up off the beach by the Royal Navy and taken back to the UK with prisoners and also with these radar elements that they'd gone in for. The second airborne operation in November 1942 was an operation called Operation Freshman, which was where 2 Horsa gliders were going to be towed by Halifaxes, your favourite aeroplane, Jane, by Halifax bombers over to the Norse hydroelectric power plant in Norway. It's about 60 miles west of Oslo. So
that's a long way to tow a glider.
It's an awfully long way to tow a glider. Just before that, there was an operation called Operation Grouse, which was where Norwegian special forces were dropped in. They used Rebecca Eureka equipment to identify the landing zones for these 2 gliders. Unfortunately, that didn't work. Everything went from bad to worse. Only one Halifax made it back to base safely. The other one crashed into a mountainside with its glider, and the other glider, the tow rope had frozen up and broken, and that had also crash-landed. This coincided, just unfortunately for the survivors, this coincided with Hitler's new commando order, which was anybody suspected to have been a commando was to be killed, basically, on the spot after interrogation. So these men were interrogated and they were murdered, and their bodies were dumped in the sea. And this obviously wasn't a successful mission. It didn't come to fruition at all. And it wasn't until 1944 that the produce of this hydroelectric plant, which was hard water, which is used in nuclear weapons, that was sunk on a ferry, and that was the only way to do it, really. The Americans had bombed it. Resistance had got in and planted explosives, and that hadn't stopped it. So what they decided to do was take the product and sink it in the...
We've all seen that film, haven't we? Yeah. One of my favourites.
Yeah. That's the
Heroes of Telemark.
That's Operation Gun. That's Operation Gunnerside. So then what we're looking at is, as 1st Airborne Division in particular is starting to build, and 6th Airborne Division, which is the junior division, is also being put together, the Glider Pilot Regiment at this point is in battalions. So later on in the war, it becomes 2 wings, number 1 wing and number 2 wing. In 1943, it's just 1 battalion. It's the 1st Battalion, the Glider Pilot Regiment. And they are earmarked for the invasion of Sicily in July of 1943. But what's important at this stage is that the only gliders that they could get to North Africa, which was going to be the takeoff point for the operation, was the American CG-4A Waco glider, which we rechristened the Hadrian. So we had the Hadrian, the Hotspur, the Hamilcar, and the Horsa gliders, all beginning with the Hadrian. The Glider Pilot Regiment itself had never been trained on this glide. They'd never flown it. They had no hours on it at all. It was going to be a nighttime operation. So they decided that what they really needed was some Horsa gliders. Now, you can't really get a Horsa glider onto a ship in crates like you can with a Waco. That comes in 5 different crates. There's wings in one, a cockpit in another, all the other bits and pieces, and they put it together. You can't really do that with a Horsa glider. So they decided they were going to have to tow them from Portreath in Cornwall all the way to Sale in Morocco. I don't think I've pronounced that correctly, but that's how it's spelt. That's about 1,200 miles. So they had specially converted Halifax bombers with large fuel tanks, and they managed to tow, believe it or not, 27 Horsa gliders, a total distance of about 3,500 miles, because they fly them first of all to Morocco, then from Morocco to Tunisia. And so it's this ridiculous...
That's crazy, isn't it?
Operation. Yeah, that's known as Operation Beggar. It's also known as Operation Turkey Buzzard. There's 2 different ways of... the RAF tend to call it Beggar, and the Army called it Turkey Buzzard for some reason. I don't know why. So, several came down in the sea. I think we've got 3 Halifax crews were lost. 3 Halifaxes were lost with 21 men, 5 horses were lost and 7 crew as they came down in the Med. When they took off from Cornwall, they'd ejected their landing gear. So there's a skid underneath the Horsa, which isn't used operationally later on. It's used for freshmen and it's used for Operation Beggar because it cuts back on slipstream. So each glider carries 3 pilots, so they can change every hour on this ridiculously long flight. And each glider also carries a spare undercarriage inside it. So they fly over to North Africa, they land on the skid, they attach the new undercarriage, then they fly on to the next location, and until they're ready, they're on the correct airfields for the invasion of Sicily. And as I say, we managed to get 27 Horsa gliders over there. And the benefit of that is that the Horsa's bigger than the Hadrian. The Hadrian, if you were to carry a field gun and a towing vehicle like a Jeep, you'd have to have the Jeep in one, the field gun in the other one. And then so you've got to tactically load and tactically land those aircraft to make sure that the towing vehicle lands on the same landing zone.
Yeah, they've got to be together.
If you lose the aircraft, if you lose the aircraft with the gun, you've only got the Jeep. If you lose the aircraft with the Jeep, you haven't got a towing vehicle for the gun. So with a Horsa, you can fit a Jeep and a gun, 6-pounder or a 75mm pack, inside the glider with the crew. When it comes to tactical loading, that's extremely important because you can land that one unit in one piece, hopefully, on the landing zone, on the target zone. So I'll just move swiftly on. I'll try not to go too much with this. But Operation Husky is July 1943. It's made up of 2 operations that the Glider Pilot Regiment and the Parachute Regiment are going to be part of, plus the Americans as well, but we're not going to cover that in this particularly. So the first operation is Operation Ladbroke, which is July the 9th, and that is to take Ponte Grande Bridge. So these both operations are to capture and hold bridges, a little bit like we see later on in Normandy, exactly the same thing. But it went from bad to worse. The weather conditions were horrendous, flying over the Mediterranean to Sicily. Tow ropes broke, combinations, which is what the tug and the glider is referred to as a combination. They were turning back and going back to North Africa. A lot of them were released too high, which meant they were released too far away, and they landed in the sea, and that resulted in 252 men drowning in the Mediterranean, which is an horrendous statistic.
Horrific.
So the fighting, they were depleted. Obviously, the numbers of men were depleted, but heavy fighting. They managed to take the bridge successfully, but not smoothly. Operation Fustian, which came later, which is the 12th of July, that sees more Horsas and Hadrian gliders towed further up Sicily, which is up near Catania. And unfortunately, they came under Allied anti-aircraft fire from the ships.
Oh, God.
So they'd flown too low over Allied ships. They didn't know what these aircraft were. They opened up. When they got through that flak, they then hit enemy flak. And so we're losing more and more aircraft. Again, some of them managed to make it to the landing zone, and the Primosoli Bridge was taken successfully. Again, successfully, but not smoothly. A lot of lessons are getting learned here as well. Mm-hmm. So we'll see that this friendly fire incident comes into its own in D-Day when you've seen the aircraft with the black and white invasion stripes.
Oh, right.
That's a direct result of what happened at Sicily, so that the Allied Navy and anti-aircraft units can identify these aircraft pretty sharpish. So moving through 1943 quite quickly, 38 Wing now becomes 38 Group. It's a much, much bigger operation. It's now 10 squadrons of Albomars, Halifaxes, Stirlings. And as we move into 1944, early 1944, 46 Group is formed, which is entirely Dakotas. So that's it becomes 6 squadrons, all flying Dakotas. So by early June, May-June time, we've now got 2 RAF groups that are dedicated solely to transporting gliders and parachutists, as well as support operations for SOE, SAS, and leaflet dropping.
So where are those pilots coming from? Are they just trained purely for this group for glider work then? For the tug pilots? All these squadrons are bomber squadrons, right?
That have been earmarked and taken from Bomber Command into RAF Transport.
Right. Yeah, with you. Yeah.
And then obviously they go through intensive training to do what they do. So things like the Halifax and aircraft such as that, they lose the mid-upper turret gunner.
Yes, of course. You wouldn't need that.
So you're going down from 5 to 4 or 6 to 5 crew members for each aircraft. Also, as we work through 1943, what I found really interesting is all the bombers coming off the production lines have glider towing modifications already on them.
Wow.
They don't have all the hooks, etc., but they do have the, if you like, for want of a better expression, they've got all the gubbins to be able to be used for airborne operations. It's seen at this point, as we've seen, that although Sicily was an uneasy airborne operation, shall we say. It was successful, it worked well, and their objectives were taken. So looking at the invasion of Europe, which everybody's doing, even in 1943, they're already looking at the invasion of Europe, it's seen that airborne forces can really work well. And of course, as we're moving through 1943, we're developing other aircraft, namely the Hamilcar glider, which is
that the massive one?
An enormous glider.
Yeah.
That's the big glider, the GAL 49. That's General Aircraft Limited. So you've got General Aircraft Limited that make the Hamilcar. You've got Airspeed that make the Horsa. You've got General Aircraft Limited also make the Hotspur, which is the training glider. And then you've got the Americans, which are making the Hadrian glider. 13,500 of those gliders were produced by the Americans, which is an enormous number. There were so many that there was surplus after the war and people were buying them and living in them and all sorts of things like that. But yeah, so we developed the Hamilcar glider. The purpose of the Hamilcar glider is it can carry a much larger field gun or artillery piece, which is the 17-pounder, which is a much bigger anti-tank weapon than the 6-pounder, and its towing vehicle. It can also carry a tank. Initially, it carries the British Tetrac tank, which is only a small reconnaissance vehicle, but a tank nonetheless. Later on, towards the end of the war, it carries the American Locust, which is a similar tank with a 37mm gun. So as we're moving in towards, obviously, D-Day, we've got three operations that 38 Group and 46 Group are going to be part of. That's Operation Tonga, Operation Mallard, and then Operations Rob Roy 1, 2, 3, and 4, which are all resupply operations. But Tonga and Mallard are the two where they're towing gliders. And we're looking at a number of gliders here. We're looking at 350 gliders on D-Day alone, which is an enormous amount of gliders. Plus, don't forget, further down the invasion coast, further down the invasion coast, we've got the Americans with their gliders as well.
The same,
so you can probably double that number for airborne forces and gliders itself. So Tonga is the very early hours of 6th of June, and that incorporates Operation Coup de Main, which is where they take Pegasus Bridge and Hulkster Bridge, which is extremely famous. Again, towed there by 38 Group, 298 and 644 squadrons. They tow over the gliders for those two operations. Later on in the evening, we've got Operation Mallard, which is much, much bigger, and that's bringing in hundreds of gliders with more and more and more troops. Because what you've actually got is a lot of people assume that they're all parachutists or paratroopers. They're not. So the way 1st Airborne Division work and 6th Airborne Division work is they have parachute battalions and they have air landing battalions. So those air landing battalions are infantry battalions that have been converted to the airborne role. So they're taken into battle in gliders. Just to confuse that more, you do occasionally get parachutists that are taken into battle on gliders, but essentially they're air landing troops, they're air landing infantry, and the parachutists do their bit, which is jumping out of aeroplanes, which I find extremely puzzling. So you've got 356 gliders for the 6th Air Landing Brigade, 6th Airborne Division, paratroops of the 3rd and 5th Parachute Brigades on D-Day, all taken there by 46 Group and 38 Group RAF. Heavy losses. This is a tough assignment. I think that's one thing I wanted to mention as well, is that this wasn't an easy assignment. This wasn't
not by
you're not doing bombing runs anymore. You're a milk run. That's not what's happening here at all. These guys are targets. They're much slower than they would normally be towing gliders or carrying parachutists. So they're a much slower and bigger target for enemy anti-aircraft and enemy aircraft themselves. So following D-Day, 46 Group, again, probably not really known too much. 46 Group fly operations backwards and forwards from Normandy to the UK, taking supplies over to Normandy and bringing wounded back to the UK with Nightingales on board. These are WAF nurses that fly out with the aircraft into Normandy, pick up the wounded, and then they can do any first aid on the way back before they land at the airfields. These are some of the first women ever to be flown into the front line. Or ever to be in the front line, never mind.
That's fascinating,
Yeah, so the Nightingales is interesting. It's some really interesting stuff. So, finally. Managed to get to Arnhem. So, for Arnhem, obviously, the whole purpose of ARNHEM is that the Allies have moved pretty swiftly across Northern Europe and they need to get into Germany. What's in their way is the Siegfried Line, and the only way to get around the Siegfried Line, as far as Monty can see, for instance, is to go up and around it and into Germany. And the only way to do that is across all these rivers, and the only way to get across the rivers is to take all the bridges. So initially, between D-Day and Market Garden, so let's say Overlord and Market Garden to be absolutely exact, we've got 16 cancelled airborne operations. So one of them is Operation Comet. And Operation Comet is designed for the 1st Airborne Division to take all 3 of these bridges, which later on would be one set of bridges would be taken by the 82nd Airborne, American 82nd Airborne. One set of bridges were taken by the 101st Airborne Division. And then Arnhem Bridge, of course, is taken by the 1st Airborne Division. But Comet is basically saying that the 1st Airborne Division is going to do all of that. And of course, that's soon put to bed. So Market Garden is, for want of a better way of putting it, it's taking several of these cancelled airborne operations and putting them all together in one operation and saying, let's do that. Because one of the things...
But on a much bigger scale, isn't it? It's absolutely enormous.
Huge.
Yeah.
It's a huge scale. You've got 3 airborne divisions being parachuted and in gliders over the enemy lines into occupied Holland, which is enormous. You've also then got 30 Corps that are in Belgium, which has got guards armoured and so on, who are then going to race up across these bridges, sweep round the Siegfried Line and burst into Germany, and there we've got our foothold in Germany. And that's the basic idea. But what you've also got to consider is that 1st Airborne Division see themselves as the senior airborne division, and they missed out on D-Day. So they'd been used for Sicily, and that hadn't gone very well. 6th Airborne had then been used for D-Day, which was massively successful, and we still talk about it to this day. But 1st Airborne Division, this whole time, are back in the UK, grinding their teeth in Lincolnshire. And you've got all these young men that are aggressive and trained to fight and trained to do a job, and they're not being allowed to do that job. So you imagine you've got all these 18, 19, 20-year-olds, thousands of them, 10,000 of them, all in Lincolnshire and other places, all going out of their minds, wanting to have a go. So you've got to do something with them. You can't keep them caged up forever. You've got to find something to do with them. And Market Garden is the perfect opportunity for that. Bringing into that as well, you've just got the 82nd Airborne and the 101st who've come back from Normandy. So they're seasoned now. They're seasoned airborne divisions that know what they're doing. So what we're looking at with Market Garden, with 38 and 46 groups, is we've now got 10 squadrons in 38 group, 6 squadrons in 46 group of Dakotas. And due to the sheer scale of this operation, it's got to be done in 3 lifts. So the perfect way to orchestrate an airborne invasion is with the element of surprise. It's to get everybody in there, off in one go, a little bit like they did with the bridges on D-Day and the follow-up operations. You've got all these, the enemy just can't believe what's going on at all. It can't believe that there's thousands and thousands of troops parachuting from the sky and landing in gliders. And it was a nighttime operation. For Operation Market Garden, it's a daylight operation over 3 lifts.
So you lose that element of surprise straight away then, don't you, after the first lift?
You massively lose that element of surprise. Yeah, you massively lose that element of surprise. So also, we've got an intelligence issue as well here, where the intelligence coming from the Dutch resistance is saying one thing, and the British are choosing to not necessarily ignore it, but to overlook that information. You're looking at the different German units that are in that area. You've got 2nd SS Panzer Division there, which is being brought back from Normandy, and it's in Arnhem. It's in the Arnhem area for rest and recuperation. Still fully functional. It's still a fully functional armoured division. It's ready to go. You've got SS units. You've got the 1st Parachute Army, the German Parachute Army there as well, all in that area. So the Dutch are telling us this, and for whatever reason, we're overlooking it.
There's an element of overconfidence as well, isn't there? At this time, yeah.
Yeah, some of the senior officers were taking in their dinner jackets.
Yeah.
Does that because they think the Germans are finished at this point? Do they think it's pretty much...
There's an element of that, yeah. And I think there's also, just as James says, there's just a massive overconfidence in what we're able to achieve. We've done it in Normandy. They kept 6th Airborne in Normandy up until early September of 1944. They didn't come home on June the 7th. They kept them in the field because they were such good infantrymen. They were airborne infantrymen, but they were extremely well trained and aggressive. And so we know that it works. And when we're looking at something that's even bigger than that, how can it possibly fail? It's, we know what we're doing at this point. So you're looking, when we're talking about gliders for ARNHEM, you're looking at almost 700 gliders. Never mind the amount of parachute transports as well, and all the follow-up resupply operations. So if we look at just some of the stats very quickly, we've got 38 group and 46 group over that period are doing almost 1,400 sorties, backwards and forwards. We're looking at glider sorties, 697 glider sorties. We're looking at resupply sorties of 630. It's incredible, really. It's just that these figures are enormous. And of course, the losses are equally enormous. After the 17th, when the element of surprise has been lost, and when the Germans have regrouped extremely quickly, because we've also got Kurt Student's parachute army on the ground.
Yeah.
They're airborne as well.
Yeah.
So Kurt Student knows exactly what to do. Modal knows exactly what to do. They know how to stop what's happening. And when it comes to the Glider Pilot Regiment itself, both wings go in on this operation, number 1 wing and number 2 wing. They've got 2 very clearly defined roles. So our 1st Airborne units, we've got the 1st and the 4th Parachute Brigades and the 1st Air Landing Brigade, plus a Polish Independent Parachute Brigade group that are all going in to seize Arnhem Bridge in one way or another. So the ground tasks for the Glider Pilot Regiment were that number 1 wing would have carried in divisional HQs. That's 1st Airborne Divisional HQ and divisional troops. And it's their job then to protect that divisional HQ. So the glider pilots aren't going to be used offensively, they're going to be used defensively. Right. Because they're so valuable. The idea is that we don't really want them going out at the sharp end because they're so expensive and valuable, but they can stay back and they can create defensive lines for divisional HQ and also a brigade HQ. So number 2 wing are going to be defending brigade HQ. That's the basic idea. Of course, it doesn't work like that. So when around the landing zones and the drop zones, we've then got the air landing regiments. You've got the South Staffordshire Regiment, the King's Own Scottish Borderers, and the Border Regiment itself. Their job is to defend those landing zones for subsequent lifts. So for the 2nd and 3rd lifts, that's what they're needing them to do. Again, that doesn't work out too well either, because as the Parachute Regiment are unable to get into Arnhem other than 2nd Battalion, so 3rd Battalion and 1st Battalion are sort of foiled in their attempt to get into Arnhem proper. 2nd Battalion, as we know, managed to get into the bridge and take it. The 16 glider pilots with them as well, which is quite an interesting bit of information, because not a lot of people think that the Glider Pilot Regiment made it that far. But 16 men of B Squadron made it to the bridge. You've got an awful lot of, by the time the men then take up residence in Oosterbeek around the Hartenstein Hotel, you've got a lot of the Glider Pilot Regiment there as well. And they're doing a similar job. So they're doing defence around the Hartenstein, which is 1st Airborne Div HQ, and they're guarding prisoners of war and things like that. And then you've got men in the defensive pocket around Oosterbeek that's made up of glider pilots and Air Landing Regiment and Parachute Regiment.
Am I right as well that with the British glider pilots, they would fight, but with the Americans, they wouldn't? Am I right in that, understanding that?
Up until Operation Varsity, that was the way the Americans worked. Yeah, they would corral their glider pilots. Obviously, if they ended up in a firefight, they were trained and they'd fight. But that wasn't what they were supposed to be doing. Again, slightly differently with American glider pilots is that they were trained power pilots. So they could fly Dakotas, they could fly anything. Right. Whereas with ours, they'd initially do an elementary flying training course to get their wings, and that'd be on Tiger Moths and similar aircraft to that. I think that was a 12-week course. 8 weeks.
Oh, that's not very
and
long.
They would then.
That's not long at all.
It's just to train, because the RAF refused to train them to fly gliders unless they were qualified pilots. So the only way to qualify them as pilots was to send them to EFTS, which is Elementary Flying Training School, where they'd fly Tiger Moths, learn to fly, hopefully qualify, get their wings, and then they'd go to a GTS, a glider training school, where they'd be taught to fly the Hotspur by RAF instructors. Once they'd qualified on the Hotspur, they'd then go to a HGCU, which is a heavy glider conversion unit, and they'd learn to fly the Horsa, and then later on the Hamilcar and the Hadrian. All this comes spilling out, doesn't it, when you start to look at it? They're not long courses. Let's put it that way. But they become. I think one of the things early on when I talked to a glider pilot veteran, I met lots of them many years ago, and I sat talking to one chap, and he said that if it hadn't have been for the RAF, they wouldn't have got to where they were going, and they wouldn't have known what to do to get there anyway. So they were very much indebted to the RAF. I think that's always worth remembering. But he was also saying that to be able to fly, you need to be quite laid back. But to be in the army, you need to be extremely disciplined. So you've got these two things that they're fighting against one another. You've got somebody who has to be, and the Glider Pilot Regiment at the Glider Pilot Regiment depot, that was orchestrated by guards sergeants. So there were a lot of men got turfed out of the Glider Pilot Regiment depot for having dirty belts or unpolished boots, or then these could have been superb pilots, but because they didn't come up to scratch with their discipline, they were out. They were returned to unit, which is incredible when you think about it.
Bit of a shock and a bit of a difference to how things were in a bomber base then, where discipline was, well, much less intense,
exactly.
Shall we say.
Exactly,
Yeah.
but you're doing a similar job. I mean, the Horsa glider isn't much smaller than a Lancaster bomber.
No, it's not.
an enormous aircraft.
Yeah.
The Hamilcar itself is like flying a garage with a wing on it. It's an enormous thing. So yeah, it's a massive contrast, and I think that this is where the RAF were always, all the way through the war, the RAF were pushing for the pilots to be RAF pilots. They were concerned that army pilots, they called them drivers initially because they saw them as just driving this vehicle into war, and took that away from them, that they were actually qualified pilots. And a lot of them were extremely good pilots. You're flying an aircraft that has no forward power. It has no lift. It's coming down, so you've got to be pretty good. You've got to know what you're doing. I think anybody that thinks you're just steering it until it crashes into a field is, they couldn't be more wrong. That's not what's happening here at all. There's a lot of skill involved in flying a glider, particularly one that's loaded with troops or ammunition or tanks or whatever you want to call it. So yeah, if we go back to ARNHEM, this is what the Glider Pilot Regiment is doing. It's supposed to be in a defensive role. As the battle changes rapidly, they obviously start to be used more in an offensive role. They go out on anti-sniper patrols. They're in the front line with the rest of the men, with the rest of the parachutists and the air landing regiments. They're doing the same sort of job. So what their job is to get troops onto the landing zones and into the battle, and all their supplies as well. So whether that's jeeps, motorcycles, anti-tank guns, anti-aircraft guns in some cases, food, ammunition. You've got ambulance units dropping with them. You've got Royal Engineer units dropping with them. You've got light anti-aircraft. You've got all sorts of things that are coming in by glider, and that's what the Glider Pilot Regiment is doing.
I just wanted to ask,
yeah, that'd be good actually.
Is it right that there's also a shortage of aircraft at this point as well to do all of these things, not just to take gliders in, but also to supply, to drop troops in? Is that correct?
Well, there is. Interestingly, at the beginning, Churchill sort of talks about these aircraft as being defunct. So it's about getting defunct aircraft that nobody wants anymore, the Albemarle, the Whitley and things like that, to the airborne forces. But as I say, as airborne forces started to develop and get bigger, and the gliders got bigger, they needed more and more aircraft. The short Stirling, as you'll know, doesn't have a good range. So the short Stirling is an excellent, high-powered aircraft, which can be used for towing gliders, but it's not that good in doing long-range bombing missions.
Yeah.
So it's used perfectly. The Albemarle itself is mainly of wooden construction, so it's not really affecting production of bombers like the Halifax and the short Stirling and things like that. So, but again, its range is low, and it can't be used for long-range bombing missions, which is what the Allies are doing at this point. They're doing long-range into Germany bombing missions. So any aircraft that can't be used for that is going to be used for airborne forces. When it comes to glider production, that was stopped in 1942 rather. That was all stopped. So it was all, I'll go for it at one point, and then because of what was happening in the Far East and things like that, that was stopped. And so there was a pause in the production of building gliders. The Hamilcar and the Horsa are both essentially wooden aircraft, and they're made, particularly the Horsa, that's made by the furniture manufacturers up and down the country. Harris Liebes, who were a huge furniture manufacturer during the war, they're making the Horsa glider in component parts. Those component parts then go to a glider maintenance unit where they'd be put together almost like a huge airfix kit, if you like. They'd be put together, and then
like the IKEA of aircraft construction.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, and you think the Horsa glider was designed before we got the Jeep. So you'll have seen photographs, I'm sure, where they're trying to get a Jeep into a Horsa glider. So just behind the cockpit on the port side, you've got a large door that folds down. You'll see photographs where there's ramps with men trying to get a Jeep up the ramp and down the fuselage of the Horsa glider. It's almost an impossibility, but they managed to do it by taking little bits off, taking a bit of the mudguard off the Jeep and taking some of the grab handles off it and things like that. They took the steering wheel off so they could get it under the main spar and then reattach it on the other side. So, and that's because they were going to take motorcycles. That's what was going to happen. They were going to take foot infantry and motorcycles and bicycles. And then once we got the Jeep, it was a case of, right, figure out a way of getting the Jeep onto there. That's with the Mark I Horsa. Later on, into 1944, the Mark II Horsa glider was developed, where the whole nose section swung open and you could just drive the Jeep up and into the fuselage and out of the tail unit. And they were used on Operation Varsity.
Gosh, it's just horrendously complicated and also impressive. But when you sort of take all these elements together, and this is the thing with Market Garden, isn't it? It's so massively complicated, and there is so much scope for things to go wrong that if just one or two of these things go wrong, it's almost like a domino effect, isn't it? And then everything else starts to just get knocked out. It's just, the whole thing is absolutely insane when you think about it. Yeah.
Well, if you think after the first lift, we've lost the element of surprise. For the second lift, we've then got the weather to contend with back in the UK. And the weather in the UK at that point is really poor. It's fog-bound. The airfields are fog-bound. So that delays the second lift. And that just gives the Germans more time to form these battle groups between all sorts of different units. They move really quickly and they form battle groups, which then go and fight for the landing zones, because they realise that what the Allies are doing are holding these and defending these landing zones for subsequent lifts. So these battle groups that they've formed move in and attack these defending troops, which in itself then causes masses of confusion. So then the third lift is also delayed. And then we're looking at resupply missions by 36 and 38 and 46 group, who are then bringing in masses of supplies by air. And they're dropping panniers and containers with ammunition and food and medical supplies and weapons. And because the Germans have overrun these landing zones and drop zones, that's who's getting it all. I've got a nice little statement here, which actually covers this quite well. So one soldier on the ground had said, The cold-blooded pluck and heroism of the pilots was incredible. They came in their lumbering machines at 1,500 feet searching for our position. The German gunners were firing at point-blank range, and the supply planes were more or less sitting targets. How those pilots could have gone into it with their eyes open is beyond my imagination. They came along in the unarmed, slow, twin-engine Dakotas and Halifaxes and Sterlings as regular as clockwork. The greatest tragedy of all, I think, is that hardly any of the supplies reached us. So if we look at, for the ARNHEM operation, there was 5 Victoria Crosses awarded, and one of those was to Flight Lieutenant David Lord, who flew for 46 Group. So if I can just read a very brief part of his
yes, please
VC
do.
citation.
Definitely, yeah.
So while flying at 1,500 feet near Arnhem, which ties in really nicely with the previous statement, while flying at 1,500 feet near Arnhem, the starboard wing of Flight Lieutenant Lord's aircraft was hit twice by anti-aircraft fire. The starboard engine was set on fire. He would have been justified in leaving the mainstream of supply aircraft and continuing at the same height, or even abandoning his aircraft. But on learning that his crew were uninjured and that the dropping zone would be reached in 3 minutes, he said he would complete his mission as the troops were in dire need of the supplies. By now, the starboard engine was burning furiously. Flight Lieutenant Lord came down to 900 feet, where he was singled out for the concentrated fire of all the anti-aircraft guns in the area. On reaching the dropping zone, he kept the aircraft on a straight and level course while supplies were dropped. At the end of the run, he was told that 2 containers remained on board. Although he must have known that the collapse of the starboard wing could not have been long delayed, Flight Lieutenant Lord circled, rejoined the mainstream of aircraft and made a second run to drop the remaining supplies. These manoeuvres took 8 minutes in all, the aircraft being continuously under heavy anti-aircraft fire. His task completed, Flight Lieutenant Lord ordered his crew to abandon the Dakota, making no attempt himself to leave the aircraft, which was now down to 500 feet. A few seconds later, the starboard wing collapsed and the aircraft fell in flames. And that's just one story out of hundreds that I've come across. You know, and I literally mean hundreds. You've got hundreds of aircraft all flying in one stream, none of them wanting to deviate from that path, all dropping supplies to these troops that aren't getting these supplies. And so therefore they're not able to do the job. They're running out of ammunition, they're running out of food, they're running out of water.
This is something that I think Sebastian Ritchie's book, ARNHEM, Myth and Reality, touches on, and that's the sort of myth that the RAF weren't fully on board with Market Garden generally, and that they made things as difficult as possible. And this is all to do with the film as well, with The Bridge Too Far, where they, the RAF is sort of seen as difficult and trying to obfuscate everything. And I think in Ritchie's book, he pretty much dismisses and dissolves this myth along with many others. And I think his analysis of the airlift plan and why it didn't work, why it could never have worked, I think is excellent. But also he deals with the issue of the supply problems as well, and also tactical air support as well. It's a really, really superb book for anyone who hasn't read it. It's not very long, but it's called ARNHEM, Myth and Reality by Sebastian Ritchie. And I thoroughly recommend anyone who's interested in ARNHEM, about Market Garden, even from an army point of view or from an airborne point of view. It's well worth a read. It is absolutely superb. Can't recommend it highly enough.
I can concur. Yeah, I've read it myself. So yeah.
Yeah.
I think the other thing is I like that it does bring in, it talks about Ebon Mail and the German paratroopers and such like, but then it also talks about Sicily, and it really builds up to Arnhem, which I think some books haven't done. I think it's a brilliant book.
But one of the things which I think
that's worth.
Yeah, go on. I think one of the things that he picks up on as well is that before Normandy, airborne operations were pretty much a shit show, to be honest. To put it, not to find a point on it. They're so difficult to pull off and pull off well. The scope for disaster in airborne operations, to put it another way, is enormous. For things to go wrong is enormous.
I think that having studied it for such a long time now, what I've realised is that a lot of the smaller operations work really well.
Yeah.
So
because they're not overly complicated.
Really well. It's a small operation. Pegasus and Horsa Bridge with the 2 bridges on D-Day. You've got 6 gliders for that operation, 3 on one, 3 on the other. That works really smoothly. But when you look at the Germans and their invasion of Crete, which is a much, much bigger airborne operation, it didn't go well at all. It was successful, but it was very costly. And at that point, that's when Hitler said, no more airborne invasions. So they kept the parachute units and they kept their glider units. The glider units were used mainly for bringing in supplies after offences, and the parachute units were used mainly on the ground. Because when you start to look at something as big as D-Day, I think that worked because it's sheer numbers, and it's also in time with the amphibious landings that are going on.
It's over a wider area, isn't it?
The bridgehead is all taken at the same time, which again works for Operation Varsity in March of 1945. Right. So as the amphibious troops cross the Rhine, the airborne forces are going in above them. And so everybody's going in at the same time. When you're looking at something like Arnhem, I mean, looking at, 3 to 4 days for 30 Corps to get from Belgium to Holland? I mean, even by today's standards, without anybody shooting at you, there's going to be quite a stretch to do that, and I think that's what we're looking at here is we're looking at trying to hammer a drawing pin in with a sledgehammer. It's just such a massive operation. One of the things I came across earlier as well was that, of course, the Germans by this point know what the Allies are capable of.
Yeah.
So they know they're going to do it again. They know they've got these huge airborne divisions and all this stuff at their disposal, all these gliders and parachutists and transport aircraft. So they know they're going to do it again. Maybe they were caught on the hop a little bit in Normandy. Maybe they'd seen what happened in Sicily and they thought, the Allies haven't really got this down. We don't need to worry too much. But let's not forget that a lot of the landing zones and drop zones in Normandy had been flooded, or they had these huge telegraph poles in as anti-landing measures. So they knew what they were capable of. And so Arnhem, even with the element of surprise, it's not that surprising because they've got just as much intelligence as any other army.
Exactly.
So they can see what's going to happen,
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's what we're looking at. The Glider Pilot Regiment was so depleted after Arnhem due to casualties and capture that to get it back up to strength, they then had to take trained RAF pilots and second them into the Glider Pilot Regiment.
But that went down well.
Operation Varsity. Well, you were volunteered into it. It wasn't a case of, tell you what, do you fancy doing this? It was, this is what you're doing. So you've got an awful lot of men that they have to go to battle school. They have to learn how to fight as infantry. Only a 2-week course. These are men that are walking around in blue one minute and they're crawling through the mud the next minute. And they're not particularly happy about it. But when Operation Varsity took place in March of 1945, which is the biggest single airborne invasion ever in one lift, half of the Glider Pilot Regiment was made up of RAF pilots.
Gosh,
this is absolutely fascinating. Yeah. I'm learning so much as well.
I always supposed to rattle through it, but there's so much information
so much,
that I'm
God,
trying
there is.
to...
Yeah. No, this is absolutely fascinating. I'm loving it. I mean, I love Arnhem anyway. I've always loved it since that film. But I've actually written an article called "Bring Up the Piat" about the legacy of a bridge too far and trying to dismiss a few of the myths. But again, Sebastian Ritchie's book was one which I refer to regularly in that article. I'll put the link up on the show notes so that people can read that as well. But God, it's just an endlessly fascinating topic, isn't it? It really is. I feel like we've just barely scratched the surface as well, but unfortunately we're running out of time. James, do you want to wind things up for us?
Yeah, just really to say thank you, Matt. That was absolutely fascinating. I've learned a lot. I went through a little bit of an Arnhem rabbit hole recently, just wanted to get hold of books, and Richie's book was one that really stood out for me. There are a number of others I really, really enjoyed. And I think
Glider Pilots at Arnhem, you need to get a copy of Glider Pilots.
Yeah, I do actually. Yeah.
By Mike Peters and Luke Boost. It's an excellent book.
Yeah.
Oh, well, we'll link that one as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. Throw these all in the links, definitely. Jane, do you want to tell us about what we've got coming up?
Yeah, coming up next week, we're going to be talking to Abby Whitlock, an American historian and museum professional, about Masters of the Air and the relationship between the US 8th Army Air Force and Bomber Command, and talking a little bit about the RAF's bombing campaign and how that was viewed by Americans both at the time and in popular culture since.
As always, do give us a follow on social media. We're on X, Twitter, and also Instagram and YouTube. And please continue to send in your questions. We absolutely love hearing them. We get some great questions. Don't forget to leave us a review or star rating wherever you listen to your podcasts. And if you would like to help us produce more great content, please hit that subscribe button in the show notes.
Thanks so much for listening, everyone, and we'll see you again next time. Thank you.